Hey there, readathon adventurers. I'm about to head up this trail, hiking to a peak that reminds me of one of the most important camping stories in our history. Today I'm reading The Camping Trip That Changed America by Barb Rosenstock, a story about President Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir going on an epic camping adventure that helped create our national parks. As I hike, we'll discover how their trip changed the way we protect the great outdoors. And don't forget, this readathon is your adventure too. Every book you read supports our school, so grab your water bottle, lace up your boots, and let's get this story started together. The Camping Trip That Changed America, Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, and Our National Parks. Written by Barb Rosenstock, illustrated by Mordecai Gerstein. Teddy and Johnny didn't have much in common, but they shared a love of the outdoors. They both loved a good story, too, and that was enough to change America. Theodore Roosevelt's family had called him Teddy since he was a boy. He grew up in one of the oldest, richest families in New York City. Teddy was short and brawny with a fashionable mustache. He loved the outdoors, hunting, fishing, and riding horses. He attended law school before becoming a politician. Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president of the United States and lived with his wife and 6 children in the White House in Washington, D.C. John Muir's family had called him Johnny since he was a boy. He grew up in the Midwest, the son of a poor immigrant farmer. Johnny was tall, thin, and quiet, with shaggy hair that curled into a long beard. He loved the outdoors, studying, sketching, and writing about plants. He hiked the American wilderness alone and wrote about his travels. John Muir became a world-famous naturalist and protector of wild places with a special love for Yosemite Wilderness near his farmhouse in California. Teddy settled into his favorite chair. He loved to end the day reading. Tonight, he chose a book by John Muir. Muir's adventures in California's Sierra Mountains sounded just about perfect to the busy president. It was strange then when Muir ended his story by asking for help for trees. He said the wild forests were vanishing. He called on the government to save them. The president thought about those mountain forests for a long time. Most people, even his own experts, thought America had so much wilderness it couldn't ever be used up. Was John Muir right? Could the forests disappear? How could the government help? As president, Teddy needed answers. Roosevelt wrote John Muir a letter. The president was planning a long trip to the western states. He asked John Muir to take him camping in California's Yosemite Wilderness at the end of the trip. If America's forests needed help, the president wanted to see those trees for himself. Roosevelt's train stopped in cities and towns along its route toward Yosemite. At each stop, bands played, officials gave speeches, and people crowded the platform to catch a glimpse of the most popular president the newspapers nicknamed Teddy. The train reached the end of the line in a small town of Raymond, California, about 30 miles outside of Yosemite Wilderness. When he found men sending his baggage to the best hotel in town, Roosevelt shouted, "By George, I'm going camping. Pack me one small sack." Along with a crowd of officials, townspeople, newspapermen, and photographers, John Muir waited to meet the president. Teddy shook Johnny's hand. "I've enjoyed your stories, Muir." The president spoke a few words to the crowd. Then he joined Muir in a waiting stagecoach. They bumped along the road to Yosemite. Another stop, more speeches. Muir was growing impatient. Didn't the president want to see the wilderness? Then Roosevelt's voice boomed. "Enough pictures, folks. I'd like to see the rest of the country in peace." The president sent his men ahead to set up camp. Leaving the shocked crowd behind, Teddy and Johnny rode off alone. "I feel like a runaway schoolboy," Teddy laughed as his horse galloped along. They stopped near a family of giant sequoias in the Mariposa Grove, surrounded by the trees of this ancient forest. For once, Teddy was quiet. When he looked up, he couldn't see the treetops. The sequoias soared straight into the heavens. "The trees grew up when the Egyptians built the pyramids," said Johnny. "They are the largest living things on earth. They never stop growing unless they are cut down." That night, under the branches of the towering sequoia called Grizzly Giant, Teddy lay on the 40 thick wool blankets his men prepared. Johnny made a bed from some branches and wrapped himself in an old cloth from his sack. He told Teddy the funny story of meeting his first bear. "Once I saw a bear in a meadow. Now, bears are shy creatures, so I jumped out from behind the tree just to see him run away. The bear looked up. I ran toward him shouting and waving. I finally stopped, or I would have run right into him. The bear then rose up, put his claws on a log between us, and glared. I'd made a big mistake about shy bears. I had to stand perfectly still for hours, or I'd have been his dinner." Finally, the bear rambled off, checking back over his hind end to make sure I stayed put. That bear and I were both scared and embarrassed, but I tell you, I was the bear that had the better manners. Teddy laughed. Was it a grizzly bear?" he asked. Johnny shook his head. "The only grizzly left in Yosemite today is the old tree. Hunters shot the last bear a few years ago." Under the trees, Teddy and Johnny slept. The next day, Teddy and Johnny rode higher into the mountains, trading stories the way friends do. As the horses plowed through drifts of snow, they reached a peak called Glacier Point. "Glaciers carved this whole valley," said Johnny, spreading his arms. He lay down on a slab of granite and inched along on his back to show how a massive river of slowly moving ice carved the rock between them millions of years ago. They camped high above the valley floor. Johnny made the president a bed of branches, and they settled near the fire for warmth. Johnny began his story. "This whole continent is a great garden. Before the beginning of time, ancient seas covered the lands, churning the rocks into soil. As the seas dried, volcanoes sculpted mountains and valleys. Glaciers carved rivers and created plains. Trees and flowers grew into forests and meadows. Wild birds and beasts filled the land. Everywhere nature sang her melody. Can you hear it?
My children should see this place, said Teddy. I hope it is still here for them, said Johnny. Under the trees, Teddy and Johnny slept. Overnight, a storm blew in, spreading 5 inches of fresh snow. Teddy and Johnny woke under a coverlet of white flakes. They shook themselves off like 2 old grizzly bears. Bully! What? Said Teddy, screeching. What a glorious day! On horseback, Muir and Roosevelt rode down into the famous Yosemite Valley. The granite formations towered above them. They passed the sheared cliff of Half Dome and the fierce face of El Capitan rising from the valley floor. On their last night, John Muir talked to the president about life in the wilderness. People were destroying wild land to make money from it. Ranchers cleared forests, prospectors mined gold, and companies planned to build hotels and shops throughout the valley. There was no one to stop them. If they keep building, the wilderness won't last another 10 years, said Muir. How can I help? Asked the president. Keep it wild, Muir said, and protect it forever. Together, Teddy and Johnny imagined a different future for America. What if everyone owned the wilderness? What if both rich and poor could spend time out in the open? What if we could save the forests for all the children to come? Teddy left Johnny in Yosemite and headed back home. His time in the forest turned the outdoor-loving president into one of nature's fiercest protectors. Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass laws saving the wilderness. He failed at first, but that didn't stop him. He created national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and national forests. With John Muir's spirit as his guide, Theodore Roosevelt saved more wild land than any president in history. Teddy and Johnny never spent any time together again. Teddy traveled the world, but called the night of the snowstorm the one day of my life that I will always remember with pleasure. Johnny felt the same. He wrote that he fairly fell in love with the president. They exchanged personal letters for the rest of their lives. John Muir lies under the incense cedar trees he planted near his home in Martinez, California. Theodore Roosevelt lies beneath the sugar maples in the Roosevelt family plot in Oyster Bay, New York. For all time, under the trees, Teddy and Johnny sleep, and their shared spirit protects our wilderness forever.
Wow, I made it to the top. Just like Roosevelt and Muir, this hike has reminded me of how incredible nature can be and how important it is to protect it. Their camping trip led to the creation of our national parks, and your participation in our read-a-thon can lead to something amazing too. So keep turning those pages, take on your reading challenge, and support our schools. Thanks for joining me on this story hike. Now it's your turn to reach new heights, one book at a time.